for our webinar, From Nature to Nurture Ecosystem Strategies for Effective Site Cleanup. And again, we're going to talk about brownfields and sort of applied bioremediation. Happy to be joined today by Danielle Stevenson and Cuauhtemoc Landeros, two very talented speakers and experts on this topic. Cuauhtemoc Landeros coming to us from Intrinsic Environmental. He's going to discuss endophyte-assisted phytoremediation, as well as an overview of this ecosystem type approach and way of looking at these sites. And then next we'll have Danielle Stevenson, who's really on the cutting edge of research and application, for using fungus on the cleanup of these sites.
All right.
Let me just mute. Oh, never mind. Someone got to it first. So again, talking about our agenda, I'm going to go relatively quick so we have time to hear the most from our experts. Give some definitions in the context of brownfields, talk a little bit about the sites. I know we have a diverse audience attending today. Talk about bioremediation and this idea of nature-based solutions before we, make it real for you. With Cuauhtemoc talking about some case studies, some sites that he's worked on, and things from his experience using this approach. And then next, Danielle, as mentioned, is going to share with us some information on mycoremediation, what she's seen in approaches for implementation, as well as this important workforce development piece that we want to empower you with some information and some things that she's been able to do. And then lastly, I'm going to wrap it up in this idea of sustainability before we end with some question and answer. So in the meantime, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll do our best to address them all at the end of the meeting, or if you want to raise your hand, you can always speak towards the end. We'll also provide the contact information of your speakers. We are recording this session. We plan to release it on YouTube, as well as we'll be sharing the slides within the next couple of weeks. This webinar is put on by CClear. I'm sure everyone here is probably familiar with our organization, but our mission is to promote the sustainable, equitable, and responsible reuse of environmentally impacted properties. And we put on events like this to empower people to make change in their areas. And one of our biggest roles is US EPA's technical assistance to brownfields provider. And I think one of our advantages is the different stakeholders and people that we reach. So really, I recommend checking out some of our in-person events, as well as following us on social media. We'd love to hear about your project and some of the challenges that you're dealing with. I'm sure most of our attendees are very familiar with this idea of brownfields, but really it means properties that are contaminated or may have suspected contamination, which is getting in the way of redevelopment. So, there doesn't have to be contamination, but the fact that you don't know means it can be a brownfield. And really, on CClear's perspective, we want to empower people to use, all the federal, state, and local tools to be able to reuse these properties and put them back into productive use in the areas where they are. And so many of these brownfields are located in environmental justice communities, due to historic zoning practices. And that makes it all the more impactful to be able to reuse them and have open space, housing or something of community benefit, so that we're able to, assist those folks, that have been burdened, by historic contamination. And so brownfield sites within these neighborhoods, they could be former oil drilling sites, closed dry cleaners, shuttered gas stations, agricultural sites. I mean, every brownfield is unique. There's a lot of different types of contamination. But again, if you have an underutilized property and there's things getting in the way of people being able to reuse the property, it could likely be a brownfield. And so one of the first things that we think about once we've confirmed that there is contamination on the property is can we deal with this contamination in place? Or are we going to have to use an ex situ method, such as dig and haul, to deal with the contamination? And so some in situ methods are things like bioremediation, which we're going to focus on today. But there's also chemical treatment and thermal treatment. And just as a thought experiment for this audience, in thinking about this idea of in situ and ex situ, When thinking of cleaning up contaminated sites, what comes to mind? Heavy machinery or natural processes like plants and microbes? When you think of the typical site that might be in your neighborhood. I think for most people, if they have experience within the environmental industry, it's overwhelmingly going to be the heavy machinery. The dig and haul, the big yellow equipment. And when we think about where these brownfields are located, areas that are already burdened by pollution, it makes it all the more important to be able to explore and empower remediation approaches that use natural processes such as plants and microbes. And so this is all to introduce this the idea of nature-based solutions and this idea of what if dealing with contamination on brownfields, we could work with nature to restore the health of the property, and tie into the ecosystem on that site, to allow healthy restoration to take place. And so nature-based solutions are actions that involve people working with nature, and we'll hear more about some specific case studies today. But there are all different types of ways that we can tie into bioremediation to heal the soil on a property, versus that alternative approach we were talking about, of having to haul soil offsite to a landfill. Might be 100 miles. Put it under a plastic cover. We have to ask ourselves, does environmental remediation and do these cleanups, always make environmental sense? And so here are some of the examples of bioremediation that we're going to dive into today. Things like microbial remediation, the microorganisms, the bacteria, the phytoremediation, the plants, the mycoremediation, the fungus. But really, the most important thing to recognize here is that these systems do not operate independently. And when you're looking through some of these case studies, you'll notice that the whole system is acting together, and that a healthy soil enables a healthy site. Um, so thank you all so much for listening. I'm going to pass it on now to our next speaker, Quatamak, who's going to dive more into his experience and work with endophyte-assisted phytoremediation.
All right, here we go. So, from nature to nurture, ecosystem strategies for site cleanup. My name is Cuauhtemoc Landeros. I represent a few entities, Organics Matters. It's my own company that is regenerative design and education and sustainable systems development. And I'm also a consultant with Intrinsics Environmental, where I cross-pollinate my experience with thermophilic compost production, soil food web microscopy, indigenous microbe collection, sustainable technologies, organic farming, and native plant habitat development. So happy to be here with you today. So mutualistic symbiosis is a close, prolonged relationship between two or more different species where all parties benefit. So throughout nature, we can see examples of diverse organisms working together as a new type of business model. We call this the ecosystem approach. So we see the potential to do remediation work where everything benefits, and thus creating ecosystems where multiple species can thrive together. And here we have a few examples. We have endomycorrhizal, bottom corner on the other side. That's the endophytes and how they live within the plants. We have lichen here, it's algae and a fungus, and just all the different ways in which we can work together. So what if we have contaminated land? What can you do? As Sebastian mentioned earlier, there's the conventional remediation methods. That's dig and haul, thermal treatment, concrete capping, injection, chemical oxidization. Not a lot of life there, and it's a little intense. And yeah, there's just, you're not really holistically working with the problem. But we have the other side of that coin, which is the sustainable nature-based methods of bioremediation, and they help jumpstart ecosystems. So here we have phytoremediation, that's plant-based. We have mycoremediation, that's mushroom-based. Microbial remediation, where they'll, use all kinds of microbes, stimulating, productivity there in the soil. And then we have algae remediation, which a lot of times they use on water sources. So intrinsics is leading the way in endophyte-assisted phytoremediation, and why we are the new evolution of phytoremediation is due to the endophytes. Phytoremediation in the past has had a lot of issues where um, plants get phytotoxicity, absorb too much contaminants, they die. A lot of sour taste in people's mouths because of that, and because of the plant's inability to kind of stay the long haul with the remediation system. You have to replant, but the endophytes give the plants really awesome capacity where they can metabolize the contaminants and consume them and break them down, break the chemical bonds. And also they help the plant with its vigor and its strength and its capacity to grow in a contaminated site, because sometimes you can't even, it's so contaminated, you can't even get the plant to grow. So it's a little tricky. Really cool thing about us is we use a lot of poplars and willows. Poplars are great because you can just take a cutting of it and then you can just literally punch a hole down into the concrete, punch right through the compacted dirt, and put it in there and let it rip. We'll put a little, compost, some nutrients in there with it. But a really awesome, simple process, and we can use kind of local native cultivars, species. We also have some varietals that we got from the USDA that have been bred to be salt and boron tolerant, and we can also inoculate existing plants, native plants, different plants that are in the area. A simple backpack sprayer method. And so we use poplar trees because they can extend 30 feet underground. Their roots do, really fast growing, live for about 30 to 50 years. Um, and yeah, easy to source the cuttings. And a mature tree consumes 50 gallons a day. So you get 1,000 trees out there, you're looking at like 50,000 gallons a day, which is a pretty huge volume of water. And if it's contaminated, and it's great that you can process that much. So phytoremediation, pre and post endophytes, you can see here just the difference of the growth when you have the endophyte in there. Like I said, before, a lot of times the plants will start growing, but after so much contamination is absorbed into their system, they'll just kind of lock out and die and get phytotoxicity. So we can drastically change that with the endophytes and have survival rate up to about 94%. So very effective. We also work with landfills. We have a partner, leachate management specialist. They specialize in landfills, but we can use our trees for dewatering, for pumping tree, for landfill leachate, for groundwater management, seep interception. If you don't want a lot of, like in landfills, you want to control the amount of water that's soaking down into the landfill so it doesn't create too much pressure and blow the liner out. We also use phytobarriers, kind of catch contaminants that are overflowing. Another thing, because we have such high transpiration rates in the trees that we use, we can get hydrological control and literally create it's called a cone of depression, but it's when you're pulling so much water out of the water table that it will slightly slant. And then a lot of times the contaminants will then kind of drift down to the lower region, and that's right to the tree roots, and then we can suck it out, metabolize it, and break it down, which is a good thing. So we also use some grass. We have some varietals that we use that are salt tolerant and really high biomass producers, get up to 6 feet tall. You can use it for energy production. There's salt tolerant varietals, and they are really good at breaking down nitrates and phosphates and hyperaccumulators. So really great in agricultural settings, or if you have a salinated soil, or you're trying to kind of prevent some of that runoff. The grasses are more of if the contaminants like overland, because the roots are very like a net and pan kind of a thing. where they're not as deep as the trees. So that's kind of a lot of surface runoff or just kind of top part of the soil profile there. And we've also worked with, you know, RDX, TNT, explosives, nitrates, unexploded ordnances. So really cool applications there where you can do some aerial seeding, you know, tractor driven application where we're seeding and we're inoculated. So we're instantly starting to break down those contaminants as soon as that plant grows. Um, you know, we're always looking for new sites to help refine these tools. And so here's another thing, the phytobuffer. So this is a former aerospace industrial site. We have some big contamination in the ground there. You can see a whole slew of different chemicals, and we're trying to keep it from migrating off the site or migrating into maybe a residential area or maybe a waterway. And it's another great way that we can do our phytoremediation by creating these kind of functional landscapes. It's another example here in a former fuel tank area, underground storage tanks, contaminated, and we have a residential area close by. So create that kind of phyto barrier buffer area, prevent those contaminants from leaking out into the community. Um, this is a former refinery that we worked on in Corpus Christi. We had contaminated groundwater and soil, non-existent vegetation. You can see kind of hard packed, looking pretty bleak, but we inoculated our pawpaw trees and buffalo grass with the endophyte treatment, and you can see it kind of becomes, you could say, park-like, but you also get these great, you know, reductions in benzene and ethylbenzene. We had, you know, 2 times a reduction in that within 2 years. So very effective and pretty, in my opinion. We have here, this is our first Superfund site that we closed, and we reached regulatory groundwater targets within 4 years and had a formal site closure in 5. We got that hydrological control that we talked about, reduced the groundwater plume, and yeah, got those chlorinated solvents out of there. This was the ideal site, I will say, because it's in Danville, Illinois, so that high humidity really stimulating tree growth, getting a lot of, you know, productivity, a lot of sunlight. So that's like the ideal kind of situation, but we can work with all kinds of situations. It's another example. We cut off chlorinated solvent plume migrating onto a base here, naval base, and EPA approved, stoked. We've had a lot of you know, great interaction with them where they can, you know, approve of our technology from Alaska to Puerto Rico, you know, creating that functional habitat that's able to break it down and break down those contaminants. Here's another site in a more arid kind of an environment. This was a former military testing facility, and we went for that salt and boron tolerant poplar varietal. And as you can see, they're just growing, just there with the sunshine, just doing what nature does, just growing. So, you know, this is a question I ask people, and I ask myself too, what is environmental justice? Like, what does it look like? And I think it looks like a forest where before only toxins and machines stood. And that's creates a positive impact for the neighborhood and the community. So much nicer to look at trees, in my opinion. I love, you know, great engineering and good steel and, you know, polished concrete, but I do really appreciate uh, nature and all that it brings because, you know, we're creating a habitat, and that's the thing. Creating the habitat then, you know, inspires all the other, you know, creatures and organisms to come along, and a lot easier to look at too. But also, you know, we in this particular case, this was a Dos Palos. This was a former gas station, and another, you know, added benefit there was we were able to save the client $1 million annually because very expensive to run a soil vapor extraction system and a pump and treat system. But we had the water board authorize the shut off of that, so saving money and you know, making some beautiful habitat is definitely a plus in my book. So here we have an example of contaminated sites, right? They're often in under-resourced areas that are in need of remediation and green space. And through the creation of shade and the transpiration process, we can help reduce the heat island effect. And by growing more trees, we can help filter rainwater, reduce runoff. This has been scientifically proven on many levels. Trees can help relieve stress, lower blood pressure, provide a sense of calm. And communities with trees are much more likely to foster connections and increase their civic pride because they have that connection to life. I think, when we're around life, it kind of inspires life and inspires that kind of organic chemistry, you could say, between people as well. So I think every community deserves more trees. And little fun fact here, in Japanese, the word Shinrin Yoku means forest bathing, and that represents being in nature and feeling its benefits. I thought it was cool. There's a cultural word for that. And so back to that functional habitat side, um, here we have, this was Spruce Goose Hangers, was a Google facility that we worked on. And, we have where we're creating this like beautiful habitat. We're, creating shade for people who work there, we're having shade for cars. And, once again, it's that reducing the heat island effect, and that functional habitat is really, really a good thing. So here we have the soil food web. This can be pretty complex, but it can be simple as well. On the simple side of things, it's um, microorganisms micronize and mobilize minerals because they're like chewing on the rock parent material, and then they're in their secretions that they have, or when they're consumed by other microorganisms, they're releasing those minerals, and that is mobilizing nutrients and minerals, creating like really nutrient dense kind of food or plants. And so, to remind you, this is a sun-powered system, right? It starts with the sun and then it goes to the plants. And the plants, are really vital in that because the plants are releasing sugars, feeding the fungi. The fungi is then, breaking down organic matter, chewing on rock itself. Same with the bacteria. The bacteria are also eating the sugars, eating the organic matter, and then they're all getting cycled through, and it's going up the trophic chain there. And this is a microscope slide that I actually shot with my camera there, and it was in some compost tea that I made, and we were cultivating back when I worked with sim soil. But that's what healthy fungus looks like, as opposed to like a oomyces is real kind of see-through, and it's not very like organized. So this is also work that I've done in the past. Here we have a thermophilic compost pile. We have this indigenous microbe collection where we're collecting microbes from the forest and putting those into our compost to get a really broad, diverse range of microorganisms to really kind of jumpstart that ecosystem health. This is a lactic acid bacteria. It's a ferment of sorts, but lactic acid bacteria is really awesome. Lactating mammals, really old relationship there. Very good for plants, good for humans. We know it as yogurt and different things along there. And this is compost tea, where once you make a compost, you can create a liquid extract of it and kind of get those organisms into a liquid solution. And then you can, distribute that a lot farther, or kind of re-inoculate back into your mother culture or your compost or your trees, whatever kind of natural system you're working with. And here I had the opportunity to work with the Pomo Nation, and that was in conjunction with the Native Health Clinic there, the Sonoma County Indian Health Project. And part of our goal there was to support tribal members' access to fresh organic food. We were able to supply the clinic's anti-diabetes program and elders care project, which nutrient-dense veggies, excuse me. And the clinic even started writing prescriptions for fresh food. So they called it our garden pharmacy. But, we used microbes to grow this food, and thus it being very nutrient dense and full of all of those good minerals that we all need for proper cell function. We also created a really pretty native plant garden there, and people were able to kind of do the leisurely walk through the garden, hang out, watch the grass grow, connect, and this is more bounty from that garden. And basically healthy lands and habitat create a place for organisms to thrive while also producing fresh, nutrient-dense organic food. This living environment provides a place to relax, nurturing communities and connecting people to place in each other. And that is the essence of this ecosystem approach. And just creating habitat that is functional, is beautiful, provides multiple different resources. And that's why we're all so stoked on this and these different technologies. So yeah, thank you for your time. Now you know what's possible. It's my contact information there. Feel free to reach out. Any questions? And thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cosmo. We have some great questions for you after Danielle's presentation. But next up, we have Danielle Stevenson to talk about her work with fungus and mycoremediation, some of the cool things she's done. Take it away, Danielle.
Sure. Hi, everybody. It is great to be here. Guatemalc, love your work. Thank you for that. So I'm going to be talking today mostly about fungi and ecosystem-based approaches to remediation. The footage in the background here is actually live from some of the remediation sites that I've worked on. So I just really wanted to intersperse some of the beauty, as Guatemalc spoke to a bit, when using these nature-based approaches to remediation. So bioremediation was already defined and covered. So I'm just going to focus in on the fungi for a second and then link it back to how it works in nature. So there's a lot of exciting potential to work with fungi to remediate and restore contaminated sites and regenerate soils and also waters. And that's going to be really the focus of this talk, although I've also worked a lot on employing fungi to reduce the toxicity of hazardous wastes. So I just wanted to set this in the context of different categories of fungi based on their ecological role. And I think this framing really helps us understand what types of fungi we might want to work with, depending on the types of sites and contaminants we might have on those sites. And also because not everyone is familiar with fungi. So the four major categories of fungi, we have our decomposers. Probably if you've eaten a mushroom on your pizza before, you're probably eating a decomposer mushroom. So these guys basically break down carbon-based like dead stuff, dead plants, and in doing so create soil. Gonna skip over the parasitic fungi, even though they're super cool, because we don't work with them for remediation. And get just briefly again mention the endophytic fungi that have already been mentioned by Guatemalc, that Intrinsic works with. These fungi live inside of plants and help them grow, and they can also decompose certain compounds. And finally, mycorrhizal fungi, it's a bit of a mouthful. Again, Guatemalc mentioned symbiotic relationships. So mycorrhizal fungi are those that live in symbiotic or mutually beneficial relationships with plants through plant roots. And now I just want to link these different types of fungi for their applications in remediation, the remediation potential. So decomposers are the fungi we work with most often to address organic contaminants. These fungi break down organic contaminants such as diesel and others through enzymes, the same way they would, break down a dead tree to get food out of it. Endophytic fungi, again, can also act as decomposers through excreting enzymes and enhance phytoremediation success, as we heard. And finally, mycorrhizal fungi, the plant root-associated fungi, can enhance phytoremediation success for metals specifically, and just help plants grow in poor and toxic soils. There's a couple specific types within these categories I wanted to call out that I've worked with a lot in my own research, as I'll give some case studies in a minute. So within those plant root symbiotic fungi that connect with the roots of plants, we have one subset called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, AMF. These fungi I work with a lot to help plants extract more metals and enhance phytoremediation success. Another type of fungus that's a decomposer called commonly oyster mushroom. You might have eaten this mushroom, produces edible mushrooms, but the living fungus, there's been a number of studies showing its potential to degrade various petrochemicals and other organic contaminants. So again, linking this back to nature, though, in nature, we wouldn't have just one kingdom of life. So we wouldn't have just plants. We would have multiple types of plants, multiple species of plants, as well as multiple other kingdoms of life. So lots of fungi, bacteria, soil invertebrates, like we saw in the soil food web, so like worms and stuff. And really all of them working together is what helps create healthy ecosystems. And when we apply this kind of conceptually to designing remediation projects, we really see a lot, in addition to a whole bunch of other benefits that I'll talk about in a bit, we just see better success than trying like just working with one type of plant, for instance. And so just to break that down a little further, so in nature, beneficial decomposer fungi known as primary decomposers, they're actually the organisms that can break down complex carbon that other decomposers like certain bacteria and worms and other fungi can't actually break down because it's too complex for them. So it's really important to have these primary decomposer fungi to start breaking down complex carbon, which is actually really similar and why they can be applied to degrade recalcitrant complex organic contaminants. Once they start that process of breakdown, then we have soil is being created, soil that can support plant life. Well, plants pull up elements to get the nutrients they need, like nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on. Metals, hazardous metals like lead and arsenic are also elements. And so plants, especially plants that are hyperaccumulators that can take up great concentrations of these metals, can be then added into the mix to remove metals from soils. When we add in those arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, we see even enhanced rate of metal removal by the plants. Now, we will start to see we don't even have to add them typically. Bacteria and secondary decomposers can now go to work on whatever organic contaminants are left behind that are now simpler. And this entire process can be applied to address mixtures of metals and organic contaminants that are really commonly found on contaminated sites of all types. And so in my 15 years or so of working on bioremediation, I've just again and again seen that the most successful projects mimic nature by exploring these multi-kingdom, multi-phased approaches that mimic ecological succession, where we have all, like we just talked about in that last diagram. So now I want to just quickly cover three main ways you can incorporate fungi into remediation projects and then get into some case studies. The first main way is that you can actually find fungi already growing on the either hazardous waste or the contaminated site, and then amplify them in place by adding, basically a little bit of easier food like wood chips and water. Or you can culture them, grow a bunch more of them out, and then reintroduce them to the site or similar sites in the region. And so this has been applied successfully in a number of remediation studies and efforts. Once you have those, those species of interest, you can actually train fungi. Not unlike how we, maybe work out or train to become stronger, better, faster. You can do the same thing with fungi to get them, even better and faster at dealing with whatever the contaminant may be, from metals to organic contaminants. And actually, this picture of the mycelium in the white mycelium in the dish growing towards that little blob, that's actually PFAS. So there's a question about PFAS. This was some training that I did of a fungus to become faster and better at breaking down PFAS. And I was doing this training in Petri dishes, but then scaling it to basically to a much larger scale for application. And another, third approach we can take to incorporate fungi into our remediation projects is just to introduce like fungal species or combination that have already been proven to, in other studies and pilots to play a needed role, right? So again, example could be the oyster mushroom, already been demonstrated to be effective against diesel, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and a few other petrochemicals. So that would be an example. And in fact, these are oyster mushrooms you're seeing from one of my own studies growing on an old rail yard, fruiting from this contaminated soil. So I've talked at length about some of my field studies in Los Angeles in other webinars and conferences. Today, I'm just going to highlight some key points from some recent and ongoing mycoremediation projects. And these will feature urban brownfields, large industrial sites, simulated landfills, wildfire sites, metal contaminated residential soils, and agricultural soils. Before we dive in there, we've worked on a lot of different contaminants with, all these different types of sites, but some that we've seen really positive results addressing with fungi. Combinations of different fungi include polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, oil and gas, metals. With metals, we always have plants involved, PFAS, and plastics as well. So first, I'm gonna just briefly shout out to some really neat post-fire biofiltration studies being carried out by Co-Renewal. I serve on the board of Co-Renewal, and I've been an advisor to some of these projects and help with some of their metals analysis. So I'm just going to share a bit about these exciting projects that are super relevant in California for sure. So this map is showing the 5 different burn scars stretching from Southern California all the way to Southern Oregon that were part of this post-fire study. And each burn scar was paired with an unburned reference site in a similar kind of ecosystem. The study employed wattles that are commonly used to prevent erosion. The only difference was these wattles were inoculated with microbes, specifically fungi. And there was a comparison made between commercially available inoculum and essentially inoculum sourced right from these areas. So you're seeing in this picture just what these wattles looked like in these burn scars. And so results are still coming in from these studies. But if you want to find out more and follow along, I did include a couple links just to find out more about co-renewals projects. And then a link specifically to the wildfire and fungi studies. Yeah, this is just a fun little piece I wanted to throw in. Some grade 8 students approached me. They were really concerned about the wildfires in California, had heard about the potential of fungi to help. And they designed and carried out a little study. They wanted to see if, if these, again, oyster mushrooms that were employed and utilized in some of the wattles would have accumulated the metals of concern in their fruit bodies, in the mushrooms. And so I supported them in some testing, and we actually saw that we didn't actually see high uptake of these metals in the mushroom fruit bodies, which is a good thing. You need a lot more information on this, on whether mushrooms forming from remediation projects accumulate the metals of concern. So I'm not going to go into detail about my PhD work at UC Riverside, other than to provide just the high level findings and share some next steps. So we did see a very good rate of hydrocarbon removal, organic contaminant removal with Pleurotus austriatus, the oyster mushroom, as compared to controls. And we saw that 99.75% reduction across multiple, everything from TCE, PCE, so solvents, PAHs, diesel and gasoline range organics. So pretty stunning result. This was seen in a year period. Although we saw a greater than 50% removal of organic contaminants in just 3 months. We tested different combinations of native plants with those arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And we did see that these combinations of native plants and AMF significantly reduced soil metal concentrations, significant as in statistically significantly, and with variable percentages of reductions depending on the metals. So in this example, I'm sharing about arsenic, lead, cadmium, and other metals within the 12-month period. So that's a pretty short time, especially for lead removal to occur. And I just wanted to help you conceptualize and just see this. So here's some before and after pictures from the 3 brownfields that were part of the study in LA. And just to kind of say, so when you mimic nature, regeneration happens, right? So these sites really started out very visibly impacted, right? There's very little plants. If there are any, it's just, invasive grasses pretty much, very compacted and toxic soils. And in, just a 1-year period, we see just such a beautiful transformation, not only of in a quantitative sense of the soil concentrations of contaminants, but also in this sort of qualitative sense. These sites are transformed into these beautiful self-regenerating ecosystems. So I'm also testing what you do with the byproducts of biological remediation, particularly for metals, which may be that, accumulated into the plants. So I'm looking at creating biofuel and mycomaterials out of those byproducts to increase the sustainability and circularity of these processes. I'm not going to show this video, but there will be a link dropped in with more footage and information about those studies. Mushrooms. I skip that. Oh boy. Sorry, I'm going to, there we go, good. Okay. um, and then the final study I'll share about here looked specifically at hexavalent chromium. So you may know hexavalent form of chromium is the one produced through industrial processes. It's the most toxic form. It's a known carcinogen. And so I looked at the addition of those two types of fungi, right? The Pleurotus austriatus and the mycorrhizal fungi, and found that the addition of either of these fungi was correlated with significant reductions in hexavalent chromium. And also really the mycorrhizal fungi, the AMF, as you can see very clearly in these photos. So this picture, the little tiny plant, has the same condition, very high levels of chromium. It is in a droughted condition, but there's no AMF. The other is the same conditions, but high AMF. So the AMF not only increase plant growth, even in droughted and toxic soils, but also reduce the chromium concentrations by almost half. And just finally, I wanted to share a little bit about some of the workforce development we've been doing as well in association with these projects and these research. This is a picture from our high school bioremediation certificate program for LA School District high school students. They're running for 3 years now with UC Riverside and Friends of the LA River. And it's a 12-week program with a mix of theory and hands-on experiential learning in association with these projects. So students gain a HAZWOPER certificate as well as experience with environmental sampling, analysis, bioremediation, and more. And we've been implementing similar programs throughout other communities in California. We had a new program this year, Civic Bioremediation, with Orange County Environmental Justice. It's 25 participants from the community living in the most lead impacted area. So this pilot and program took place addressing lead contaminated soils in residential backyards. And just to close and kind of link it all back together to build on what Guatemala was saying and Sebastian, the largest waste stream generated in California is contaminated soil from these site cleanups, right? 56% of that is shipped out of state for disposal. And this contaminated soil excavation contributes to huge amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's really a lot of possibility with these nature-based approaches for enhanced sustainability and equity in remediation, right? So they're in situ, so we have reduced emissions. They regenerate soil that can support plants. They reduce risks to fence-line communities, enable these sites to be transformed into parks and other green spaces. They can protect and clean water resources and build a regenerative economy and workforce with local jobs. So I hope that you'll reach out if you have questions or want more information. Recently founded a center for ecological remediation, and I'm always looking for collaborators and projects. So feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was awesome. So finding harmony. Like I said, I hope that you leave this webinar, understanding how nature-based solutions on brownfields can support open space development and really put parks, open space, and support the ecosystems in the areas that need it most. Cuauhtémoc shared some food garden type work, the workforce development. There's all types of societal benefits that can come up with this approach to brownfield cleanup. And it's not necessarily a dichotomy between dig and haul and these in situ approaches either. Of course, we are talking about more innovative ways, and that can mean to have it make sense for the project timeline or for regulatory approval. You might have to pair a nature-based approach with dig and haul, or with some type of chemical treatment as well. If you want to apply this type of method, really our advice is to plan early. You'll likely have to pilot this type of technology. There are lots of things that can happen in the lab that you want to replicate at your site, so that you know that this is the right approach, and that takes time. But ultimately, building this more complex conceptual site model and remedy, can save you a lot of money, while minimizing the detrimental community impact. And we want to inspire you to consider, the long-term users of the site, both human, animal, nature, everything as you're making important site decisions, and looking at the sites in your community. So we talked a lot today about the site as a system, but just tying it into this global idea of sustainability, and with brownfields and sustainable remediation, it's both what comes next for the site, as well as how we're doing it. And so, considering environmental protection, economic development, and again, trying to define the community benefit from the site. And so there are so many decisions that we can make from a sustainable perspective. Ultimately, the way to evaluate them is a life cycle analysis, which can help us understand the impacts of these decisions. Um, and that's all to say that when we're looking at these nature-based solutions, we can see the environmental benefits of the pollution reduction, the biodiversity support, the carbon sequestration, as well as not putting trucks on the road potentially hundreds of miles. And ultimately, even above regulatory, limits, we can be improving the soil and water health and conditions on these sites, and building more climate resilience. We talked a lot about bioremediation today, but there's also biomimicry and a lot of other important concepts that we can learn from nature, when managing these sites. And there's the cost effectiveness too. Sustainability can make dollars and cents too. Oftentimes once we start up some of these systems, they can self-sustain over time. And these conventional approaches, beyond just, dig and haul, also pump and treat is not cheap. So if we can replace a pump and treat with a pump and treat system, there's potentially a lot of money that can be saved, in addition to supporting the ecosystem at the site. And again, think about the aesthetic improvements. We saw a lot of pictures, but this idea of having a beautiful park or trees on the property, where previously there was concrete or, some type of urban mess. And that goes into the public health benefits. And when we're developing parks, the recreational opportunities as well as ultimately these sites, and we can look for training opportunities to develop jobs as well. Like I said before, knowing if EAP or mycoremediation makes sense at your site, it can be very appropriate to conduct a pilot study. So we want to encourage you to reach out to look at universities or consultant partnerships, and ultimately build a team for success. As you're doing that, you're going to want to collect some basic information on your site, because so often the answer is, will this approach work on my property? It depends, right? We have some good questions in the chat about different types of contamination, which we'll talk about. But ultimately, a lot can be solved in a 15-minute discussion. And lastly, one of C-Clear's specialties that I shared at the beginning is helping connect people with brownfield funding and grant opportunities. And the great thing about these approaches is that we're at an intersection, of a lot of different, opportunities. Beyond just brownfield development, there's a lot of climate resilience grants and open space development opportunities that we would love to talk to you about. And so there are some, major programs like ARC, community change grants, and state-specific tribal opportunities, that can make these projects possible. And so often, the successful projects that we see might have public funding, but they're able to leverage private funding as well, to make great projects happen. And so I encourage you to schedule a TA meeting with C-Clear for more in-depth support. We'd love to hear about your project. But with all of that said, we're going to hop into question and answer now. So here we have the contact information for Quasamok and Danielle. We'll share that in the chat as well. I'm going to stop sharing screen, and start to read some of the questions from the chat. But in the meantime, if you would prefer to read your question, or ask your question directly, feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you, and try to alternate. But again, thank you all so much for your time. We really hope that you got something valuable out of this discussion. So to begin, Danielle, first, do you have any thoughts on the phytoremediation of PFAS or any updates from the research that you've seen?
Yeah, I've seen really good results with fungi, specifically decomposer fungi, not with plants, and I haven't tested plants. And that's the reason I selected decomposer fungi instead of plants is just because in nature, these are the main decomposers of carbon-based materials. So yeah, I don't have info on plant remediation of PFAS, but maybe Guatemala does. But I have seen good results with fungi.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, some of the tests that we've done with PFAS is we can get the PFAS into the plant body. So we can basically immobilize it, but then at that point, you have to take it to the incinerator basically to break it down.
Yeah, and that speaks to, PFAS and the chemistry that made it and what it's used for is that it's incredibly hard to break down, right? But at least using, one of those endophyte type systems or tree systems, you could contain it and stop the plume from going off site. Um, and even like the approach that you said, a lot of the other conventional approaches for dealing with PFAS are very difficult as well. Ben, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you both for all of you for the presentation. And Sebastian, you kind of spoke to the question I'm going to ask, so thank you for that. I was wondering, Danielle mentioned, for instance, I'm in affordable housing. So if you had a site that, depending on the size, again, maybe a couple acres, and Danielle's research was showing that they were getting good results in 3 months to 12 months. Is it possible you think to like you said, dig from one part of the site where the buildings might be, move that to another part of the site where the landscaping may be, for instance, and then treat it with some of these bio processes on site to remove whatever contamination is, so that the construction of the buildings might be able to go a little faster?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I'd love the opportunity to test that out. Yeah, and then yeah, the only thing I'd say in terms of the timeline, just for people's context, is that if it was only organic contaminants, depending on what types of contaminants and their concentrations, there might actually be able to be a much faster cleanup. But if there's metals, especially high concentrations of lead, it just will take more time. So just something to consider. But I really like that proposal. That seems like a good approach.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Guatemala, would you mind sharing your experience with dry climates and the endophyte assisted phytoremediation, or just generally, how you think about climate and how to use this approach?
Yeah, so in a more arid climate, you do have to supply some auxiliary water to your trees, obviously, to keep them kind of going. Um, but there's, simple ways to do that. If you have, slope, you can do gravity fed. Um, like we said before, we do pump and tree. So we've had some instances where we were able, because the tree roots can only go 30 feet down. So if you're dealing with contaminants that are deep in the water table, we've pumped water from 220 feet deep, and then we'll put it in like a double lined trench, or we can put it in like big, IBC tote containers and water the trees that way, subsurface irrigate them. But yes, you do need to, supply some water to your trees to keep them going. But we can pull that water from really deep if it's beyond the root zone. And yeah, that is kind of a thing that you have to clutch there. But there's some other things that you can add to your trees, like biochar, that really extend the moisture holding capacity of your soil. Compost as well will hold more water. So there's a couple angles that you can come at that arid climate with. But yes, water is necessary for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, great. And I think there was a cool sort of sustainable way suggested in the question too of maybe using the leachate or some other, type of use of local water with less demand on the system. Would you mind commenting on Ursula's other question about endophytes being endemic to specific climate zones and your experience there with regionality?
Yeah, we have worked from Alaska to Puerto Rico. So you can, the endophytes are specific to the contaminants, and we can stack different types of endophytes within the same species of tree. The endophytes also play well with other plants. So we can put them in native plants, we can put them in conifer plant, the there's not a lot of barriers there. The thing and the reason why we use the phreatophytes, mainly the willows and poplars, are because they are so fast growing. You can just take a cutting and grow a tree from a cutting, and they transpire a lot of water. And when we're really trying to suck a lot of the contaminant out of the ground at as fast of a rate as we can, that's why we use, those poplars and willows, because they transpire a lot of water. So no, they're not necessary. We found, these endophytes were discovered by Sharon Doty, University of Washington. They come from the Pacific Northwest, is where they were discovered at multiple different contaminated sites. But they are symbiotic with the tree. So as long as the tree is living, they are staying in the tree and they are growing. But like I said, from Alaska to Puerto Rico, so that's basically, tundra to tropics. So, and all in between the arid regions.
Very cool. And really speaks to the opportunity here for different projects and the metaphor I've heard for your organization's approach before that I love is that it's just like supporting, like our gut within our stomach for the development of a good, healthy immune system. So that the trees or plants are able to survive, taking up materials that they otherwise wouldn't. Um, you did a great job answering this question in the chat, Cuauhtemoc. But Danielle, do you have any thoughts on what contaminants are actually broken down by endophytes and mycoremediation versus stored in the tissue? And then again, I've heard you speak on this before. Any considerations of when you need to dispose of the material as hazardous waste or not?
Yeah, so metals generally don't break down, so they can just be moved around. So endophytes, what plants, other fungi, their interactions with metals typically would be to either stabilize them or take them up into their bodies. Where now the metals are in, the plant biomass or whatever. So yeah, endophytic fungi will do the same thing. Endophytic fungi can degrade organic contaminants, those carbon-based contaminants. So yeah, that's generally how it works. And in terms of their disposal of the plants or fungi for that matter that have taken up metals that don't break down, you typically have to test to get a sense of the levels, and that'll help you figure out how to dispose of them. But yeah, typically for large projects, controlled incineration or sledging of the plant biomass is used, and it maybe sounds intensive, but truly it's amazing that instead of having to dig up, acres of contaminated soil, you just pull the metals out of the soil, concentrate that biomass, and end up with a small amount of concentrated metals that can be properly disposed of as hazardous waste or re-extracted and utilized.
Well said, and it could be a fraction of the amount of soil that you would have to excavate otherwise. Sort of a similar climate question, but what's your experience with mycoremediation in like Alaska? Have you ever seen people growing oyster mushrooms up north?
Yeah, I'm actually from Canada. And so I started all this work up in northern climes, and yeah, I had a lot of success as far just about in Alaska. But I know of a project. I have friend of a friend who did a project with oyster mushrooms in Alaska. I can try to quickly dig up the paper and drop it in the chat. But yeah, it's definitely been tested up there successfully.
Awesome. And just a reminder for folks, feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask a question live. I see a couple more in the chat, so I'm going to keep going. Um, but from Mason Reed, this is for you again, Danielle. When you discuss successful bioremediation projects with hyperaccumulator plants and fungi, does this apply to only highly contaminated sites or sites with only slight contamination? Hyperaccumulator plants are generally not used for remediating metal contamination due to low efficiency. Are fungi more effective?
So yeah, I've worked on sites from like, again, backyard residential soils to agricultural soils that have low but elevated metal contamination, all the way to like super fun sites that are highly contaminated. And I've seen promising results across all these types of sites. Obviously, if it's metals, it just can be a quicker cleanup if the levels are lower. If it's a more highly contaminated site, again, with metals, it just will take longer to get those metals out. There's just more metals to pull out of the soil. And lead's chemistry in particular makes it a little difficult to pull out of the soil. That being said, what I've seen again and again in my own field studies is that when you have these different beneficial fungi, that rate of removal is a lot faster. I didn't show those figures in my presentation today, but you can find them in other webinars. Yeah, it's really the fungi that make all the difference. And I think fungi have been overlooked in a lot of these studies, which might have been part of why good results weren't seen. Yeah.
Awesome. What is your experience with mycelium being used to replace herbicide use?
Yeah, I've only worked on one project with that, and we explored basically creating these like fungal liquid fungal amendments that get sprayed to target specific invasive plants. So I've only worked on that one time. It was a really cool approach. I've seen a little bit of other work on that as well. And I think that type of biocontrol is really promising. Again, it's mimicking nature, and it's just a lot safer and less toxic and more targeted than a lot of chemical herbicides.
Yeah, and sort of the same question, Cuauhtémoc, but with endophytes. I know the approach that you use could definitely be used to control an existing herbicide plume, right? But what's your experience with using herbicide on these projects?
Yeah, we do have endophytes that will, help expedite the breakdown, um, of the herbicide. Yeah, but the endophyte, the plant species itself being the herbicide, you could get some out competition if you were to maybe use like a grass, like a heavy producing grass. You could use that to kind of outcompete maybe a different type of a plant that's invasive in there. Um, but then you have that plant there. So I guess it just kind of depends on what's the reason, what's the need there as far as removing the unwanted plant species there.
Yep. Okay. Next question. Just interested, Cuauhtémoc, if you have any experiences with projects where bioremediation was used to address water contamination. I think that was a lot of the projects you shared today.
Yeah,
Any other perspective?
yeah. I mean, most of the stuff that we do is groundwater. A lot of groundwater issues, surface water too, especially the grasses are more the surface water, because of that, really net kind of a root system that they have, and they're fast growing. That's surface water. And then kind of deeper groundwater, that's those pumping trees. That's working with our collaborators there, the leachate management specialists, where we're specifically working with leachate from landfills. And you know, and then just the poplars and the willows, they transpire a lot of water, so that's exactly, you know, what they are for, is you know, pull that groundwater out of the water table.
Well said. And again, once you create like this healthy ecosystem on the site, the water quality can go up beyond the regulatory level. Oftentimes without a lot of operation and maintenance. Danielle, what is your experience with scalability of mycoremediation?
Yeah, and just quickly too, wanted to shout out that we've worked quite a bit with fungi and combinations of plants and fungi for different types of water filtration, both in soil and, stormwater, wetlands, groundwater, along rivers, so riparian systems, streams. So it's an exciting area for further research too.
Awesome. Maybe we can share a project in the email follow-up, but also Deja, if there's a specific type of project or challenge that you're thinking about, we'd love to hear about it so we can be a little bit more specific.
Yeah, thank you. There's nothing specific. I think we have a lot of water issues in LA, from water sources, drinking water, groundwater. It's kind of every possible type of water is contaminated. So I just wanted to learn a little bit more about varying types of ways to address water contamination. So both insights are very helpful. So thank you to the presenters.
Absolutely. And like the advantage of one of these approaches of like, you could plant trees while the buildings or the existing operations on the property are continuing. So there's a lot of potential with this non-invasive approach. Um, Thank you for asking. So we'll see if we have any good projects we can share with you when we send the recording of this presentation out. Danielle, would you mind going back to the scalability with microremediation before we close?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the scalability is a great, remember we talked about 3 different kind of ways to introduce or to include fungi. It's a major advantage of the first approach where you just kind of amplify the fungi that are already there. That's a lot easier than growing a whole lot of inoculum to introduce. Another thing I'll say, I've utilized spent blocks from mushroom farms. So waste that ends up in the landfill in a lot of my studies because of the scalability of that, right? They're producing tons and tons in most cities and rural areas. It's free, it's saving waste from the landfill, and it's fungal mycelium that can be utilized in these projects at scale. The third thing I'll say is I'm also exploring this because it's a great question. It's something we got to figure out for this field to keep expanding.
Well said. Which is our call to action that we need projects to use this technology. These approaches are cutting edge, but bioremediation is nothing new. These are just the experts on the front line that are dealing with these challenging problems. So we would love to hear from you from these projects if you have a specific challenge that you're dealing with, so we can put you on the right path to success. Again, just want to give a big thank you to our 2 speakers today. Some really great information shared, and thank you everyone for their time. Cuauhtemoc, do you have any closing words?
Just many thanks to everyone for your time and energy and interest, and may the forest be with you.
I'm stealing that one. And you, Danielle.
I love that so much. Thank you all for coming and showing up to learn. It's so nice to see so many folks excited about these topics. And yeah, again, thank you. Don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to learn more or collaborate.
Awesome. Have a great afternoon, everybody.